I'm hoping to hand over to you before the next hour or so is gone, and particularly within probably the first 20, 25 minutes, and then we can talk about particular questions or details as you know them. Those four things are to give you a very quick background on why did the trust clause come into the Book of Order to begin with. Then talk about what good is it for us when we aren't leaving the denomination. Then look at the language of that particular paragraph a little more closely and what does it say and what doesn't it say. And then finally reflect a little bit on the Tom decision from about a year ago, which was a GA, Permanent Judicial Commission event having to do with San Francisco Presbytery and one of the churches there. And what does that mean for the way that we live it out nowadays? So that's kind of the picture. Here's your first opportunity to walk if you're thinking, oh, that's not at all what I thought he was going to say. The posters behind me are kind of the low-tech way of outlining what I'm going to say. So rather than flipping on the PowerPoint and you coming in at the wrong moment and then like, wait, what did he already say? This is a chance when you lose interest in what I'm saying to kind of think about what you're seeing, and it'll all do the same thing. Here's where we began. Before 1979, and going back into the 1800s, the American courts had a system where they essentially divided churches into hierarchical churches and congregational churches for the sake of dealing with property and assets. And depending on which kind of church you were, they would then deal with you accordingly when it came to the relationship with the larger denomination. So in other words, if a church wanted to leave the Presbyterian Church in 1920, there would be a court that would look through the Presbyterian Constitution and decide, are they a congregational church or are they an Episcopal hierarchical church? And therefore, who gets the property? In 1979, you had a watershed event, which is that the Supreme Court said, no. The courts are not in the business of interpreting theology for churches. That's a First Amendment violation. And so they essentially said at that point, it's up to the churches to tell the courts, what are you? The courts are not allowed to decide that any longer. And that forced the Presbyterians to create explicit language within their constitution to declare that position. And that's sort of then when and why the trust clause became an explicit thing rather than just a common understanding. So in the window from about 1979 to 1982, there was a lot of work that was done, both in the Northern Church, the UPC-USA, and the Southern Church, the PCUS, before reunion, so that that language found its way into both of their books of order. It was added not as an invention. The important thing here is to understand it was added as a reflection of who we already are, rather than as sort of, oh, here's our opportunity, let's get this hammered down. And the idea behind that is that who we already are is that we are one church with multiple locations all around the country. As you see on the tag here, we're one church with 10,000 expressions of that church, 10,000 sites, 10,000 congregations. That is fundamental to Presbyterian church doctrine of what it means to be the church. And so it reflects that theology. And then it goes beyond that to say, okay, because we are this way, we do our ministry in coordination with one another and in partnership with one another. And that means that this provision protects the little congregations. It means that they get looked after when just the run of the marketplace would roll them by. It means that when it's time for loans to be taken out for building projects, for instance, the denomination is the one who's on the hook rather than just the local congregation. So say you enter into a $5 million building campaign and you find out that you're in over your ears, that the pledges didn't come through the way you have in mind. In a Baptist church, the only option the church has got is default and bankruptcy. In the Presbyterian church, it's not even that there's an option out there, it's that the presbytery immediately becomes the fallback position when the church gets stuck. And so the presbytery will come in when there's a sign of things not going well and saying, we're going to help you here. We are motivated because we don't want to end up with this $5 million ball and chain. So that's kind of the second, what's in it for us when we stay. And then the third one, related to the first one with the little guy, is that it allows us to leverage resources for the benefit of the whole church. So if you're thinking, for instance, the Board of Pensions is a great example of that, where the assets of the whole church can be used to get a better deal for the individual churches in such a way that they end up doing better than they would do on their own. So we've just gone bang, bang through the first two. How did we get here? What's in it for the churches that are there? What's the benefit? I want to slow down now a little bit and talk about language. And this is where this system may fall a little short, because I thought about the idea of putting the entire paragraph on a sheet and decided that that would be enough words that it's probably not worth it. So instead, what I'm going to ask you to do is kind of do a careful listening as I read that paragraph. If you're the type to take notes, it's G-4.0203 in the Book of Order. G-4.0203. And there are basically 5 pieces in that paragraph. And I'm going to break it down and then we'll talk about each one before we get to what did Tom have to say about the matter. Piece 1, all property. 2, held by or for a congregation, a presbytery, a synod, the General Assembly, or the Presbyterian Church USA, and whether the property is used in programs of a congregation or a higher council is like presbytery, synod, General Assembly, whether the property is used in programs of any of those things or retained for the production of income. Oh, I jumped one. Sorry. All property held by or for a congregation, etc. Here's number 3. Whether legal title is lodged in a corporation, a trustee or trustees, or an unincorporated association. Then we get on to 4, whether the property is used in programs for a congregation or a higher council or retained for income. And then 5 is held in trust nevertheless for the use and benefit of the Peace USA. Let's unpack that a little. But keep in the back of your mind as we're unpacking that the single most important phrase here is not the word trust, as trust clause, somehow it ended up kind of in the common vocabulary that way. I would argue that the single most important and useful phrase for remembering what we're talking about here is the phrase use and benefit. That's what this conversation is all about. So all property. Property is more than real estate. That's what this means. It doesn't matter how the property is held. So here's a for instance. When it says, for instance, whether the property is used for programming or whether it's used for the generation of income, if your church has an endowment, for instance, where the principal is locked up and the income, the interest off of that principal is then used for programming, that principle is part of the all property rule that fits under the use and benefit clause. That just as much as the land or the building that the land sits on is understood as being for the use and benefit of the Peace USA. So that's kind of the all property piece. The second thing we heard is it doesn't matter who holds the property, right? Whether it's a congregation, a presbytery, synod, General Assembly, anybody can be the holder of that property so long as it is church property. We're not talking about here if a person is lending their house to the church for the sake of a midweek Bible study. We're not saying that that belongs to the Peace USA. But that sort of any property that is held for the church programming or for the presbytery programming, that would include like a camp, is part of that use and benefit rule. Doesn't matter who holds it, and it doesn't matter what it's for, and it doesn't matter where the legal title is lodged. So you can have an unofficial association, kind of more like a homeowner's arrangement. You can have a 501c3. You can have a limited partnership. Doesn't matter. That's sort of whatever it is, it's still use and benefit. And then it doesn't matter why the property is there. If it's for programming, it's for generating income. If it is a camp, if it's a Sunday school classroom, all of that is treated equally. And that then boils down to, regardless of all these things, it comes back to the idea that it's all for the use and benefit of the denomination. That's trying to think what the right word is here I want to use. That is the weight of gravity in this paragraph. That's where we don't stand kind of loosely and float on the surface of the moon, but we're really rather on the surface of Jupiter or something, hardened down to the ground with this thing that says, this is the churches. This is the denominations. And whatever we do from here on forward has to recognize and reflect that fact. That's a high bar. The bar was put to the test. Give me a sense of the room here. When I say the Tom case, show of hands, is it meaningful? Generally meaningful. Okay, I won't belabor it then, but let me just make sure that we kind of have the basic common background. Tom was the event in the Presbytery of San Francisco about a year and a half ago now, where the Danville Church, which was a fairly substantial congregation, several thousand members, lots of property in a growing part of the Bay Area, was dismissed to the Evangelical Presbyterian Church with its property in exchange for a few years of per capita giving and a few years of mission giving. The Presbytery of San Francisco, in general, was happy with that outcome. They thought it was fair. They thought it honored the great ends of the church. They, in particular, thought that it honored a policy that they had put in place called gracious dismissal, which is probably also a phrase that you've heard a great deal of in the last couple of years. But not every single person in the Presbytery of San Francisco was happy with the outcome. And so what happened was that a remedial complaint against the presbytery was filed and ran its way up the course. And ultimately it ended up with the Permanent Judicial Commission of the General Assembly. And even though by that point Danville was out the door and the papers had been signed and it was all over for them, the GAPJC issued a ruling to instruct everything following, to say, this is what it's going to mean in the future for you to understand this provision of the Constitution correctly. And so there are some key pieces in Tom that are reflected here. Key piece one is that every situation is unique. So the presbyteries aren't allowed to write a policy that says, if we get this percentage of people saying they want to go to a new denomination, then they donate this percentage of money to the presbytery and it's all over and we don't have to look at it or think about it, it's easy pie. Instead, every single one has to be engaged on its personal merits, case by case, in view of the trust clause, but also in view of the circumstances of the church, in view of the circumstances of the presbytery, in view of the relationship between those two. It all has to be done over again. And so it's kind of this, on the one hand, the reaction is this frustrating thing of, why can't we just write a computer program and be done with it? But this is very explicitly, no, every time is going to be a new time over again. The second thing that Tom said is that it is the burden of the presbytery to act on behalf of the denomination to uphold the trust clause. And this is where the Tom case became a very specific moment, where the GAPJC essentially said that San Francisco had failed in its duty by letting Danville go without any reflection upon the value of the Danville property. San Francisco had done something which was fine for San Francisco, but San Francisco had not operated as, and the word they used was fiduciary, the person with kind of financial responsibility to look out for the interests of this person, or body as it is. I mean, so think about it like in terms of a minor whose parents have died, and there's the what's the word? Executor? Is that the right word? The executor who's managing the estate for the good of the minor until the minor comes of age and inherits the estate that is rightfully theirs by virtue of inheritance, but they can't manage it for themselves. And it's really the responsibility of the executor to look out for the good of that minor, not to do whatever seems right or is convenient for them. We're in much the same kind of position, that the presbytery becomes the executor, the denomination becomes the beneficiary, and our job then as presbytery is to look out for the needs of the denomination. So that's item number 2. And then item number 3 is the settlements have to be relevant. This is an awful, awful word if you like writing a computer program. Because this is the word that when people sit down together, they've got to figure out what it means, practically speaking. But there can be no explicit answer to that question in the form of numbers. Is 5% relevant? Is 95% relevant? How much would we get on the open market? I don't know. I'm not a realtor. I'm not a banker. But that's the thing that Tom insists on. And what Tom has done by saying that the settlement must be relevant is that if Presbytery says yes to a deal, so to speak, and the question arises then is, how does that have anything to do with the fact that this is supposed to be the presbytery, or the denomination's property? I don't see the connection here. That's when the potential for it running its way up the church's judicial process occurs again. Here's where I'll talk a little turkey about where we're at, and this is kind of beyond the promise, but it's probably what you all care about the most for our sake right now. If one of our discernment teams brings a proposal to Presbytery, we've passed the first gate on the way to home free. That gate is that a bunch of Presbytery peeps and a bunch of church peeps have come together and they're good. They like, okay, we see it. We can do this. That's the second gate, is that Presbytery itself, by a majority vote, will look at it and go, yeah, looks good. We've got 3 more gates that we have to get through, one of which we might be able to dodge. But at least 2 of them, it's really got to get through. The third gate, that's probably the obvious one, especially to those of you on the ground, is the congregation. It does no good for us to come up with a solution that everybody on the presbytery side thinks is hunky-dory if everybody in the congregation thinks is awful, right? That just, we're dead in the water then, time to start over. But the tension comes when the presbytery says yes and the congregation says yes, because then we're on the 4th gate, which is all it takes is one person with judicial standing in the presbytery, meaning they're a commissioner or a pastor and member of the presbytery, or even the synod, for instance, looking over our shoulder, to say, I don't see it. It just doesn't look to me like the use and benefit is what this is all about. And all they need then is to file a remedial complaint against the presbytery, and then we've got a 5th gate we have to get through, which is the synod PJC. I'd love to avoid that fifth gate, which means that getting this done, the burden of these teams is to come up with an answer that even that one person maybe won't see it, but their eventual answer to the question will be, you know, I don't see it, but I can see that the presbytery has been dealing really in good faith here, and I can see that the joint discernment team is really convinced that this is the right thing all around. Even though I'm not making the connections, they're making the connections, so I'm going to stand down. That may be the best we hope for in those moments, because honestly, 100% consensus, I'm not accustomed to that very often in Presbyterian circles. But that relevant word, right? I mean, imagine sort of like we do in the courts, the reasonable person test, which is if an average person looks at this deal and says, yeah, I can see a connection between this is for the use and benefit of the denomination and what we've done here. Okay. That's what we're aiming for. But the thing is, we can't put a formula on that. Because as soon as we attach a policy number and saying this counts as use and benefit, it's going to go down the tubes in a PJC finding. Yeah. Don.
If the settlements must be relevant, if that goal is not achieved, then what would be the role of the Synod PJC?
They would basically say that what we did doesn't rise to the level of constitutional, and they would kick it back to us and say, do it over again. Come up with a settlement that does work to fit that definition. Yeah. Don.
Using your numbers before, if we talk about relevancy, you said, maybe somebody would say 5% is relevant, somebody else would say 95% is relevant. If a PJC, JDT,
Joint discernment team. That's the folks who are doing the work on the ground right now. Okay.
Yeah, if a team comes back with a recommendation that does take into account the value of the property and assigns what they think is a reasonable percentage to that, and somebody in Presbytery says, I don't like that, I think it isn't big enough. Is that something that would be a legitimate challenge? If a team came back and said, 25% is what we think is a good number, and somebody else said, no, I think it should be 50%. Is that a legitimate way is that a challenge to relevancy?
It is not likely that, no, as soon as I say that, I'm making odds on things. Let me tell it to you this way, because I think I know what you're getting at, Don, and I think what I would do is say that a person came to me and they were really out of sorts, and they're just convinced that we have not, that the Presbytery, even though the Presbytery green-lighted the thing, that it has just been in bad faith with the denomination. And they come to me and they say, what are my options here? And as stated clerk, my obligation is to give them the options before them and to give them their best bet. What I would tell them to do is not complain on the basis of the number. Not file the complaint saying it said 25% and 25% isn't enough, it should have been 50. What I would encourage them to do is to articulate in such a way that it says that no apparent relationship between the final settlement and the property belonging to the denomination is apparent in this arrangement. It's much more vague and open-ended, but then what it does is it leaves it in the hands of the Synod PJC to look at it themselves and say, do I think it is or isn't?
So the teams on the ground should connect it to the value of the property.
There needs to be some way in which that final number is related to the value of the property. Candy.
Of course, wouldn't they, though, in the same turn, have to give specificity to that, to say because of this, this, and this? Just like there has to be a correlation between what the value for use and benefit is, not only property, but ministry, mission, all that stuff. Can they just make an appeal just by saying I don't think it meets that argument, or will they have to demonstrate because of the seeming disparity between this particular aspect of this conversation
Right.
and this?
Right.
Between this being this and their resolution being this seems to be not.
When you say they, you're talking about the complainant.
Yeah, the complaint.
Yeah.
I mean, can they just throw a wrench in it just because they say, I don't see that meeting that requirement? Or
There-
do they have to be specific?
There are two answers to that. Yes and yes. They can throw a wrench in just by saying, I don't see it. And then the thing will be, will the Synod PJC recognize that? Quick briefing, you want a quick briefing on judicial process? Show of hands. Okay. Poor Karen. Okay, quick deal is, when a complaint is filed against a presbytery, for instance, to the Synod PJC, it begins with the moderator and the clerk of the PJC sitting down with the complaint and asking some key questions. Did the person who complained have standing to do it, right? Are they are they just Joe on the street? Well, too bad. Another one is, are they complaining to the right group of people? In other words, is it our synod as opposed to the one up north? Eventually, it gets around to probably the most important question, which is, if we do take this to the entire PJC, is there a possibility this could be fulfilled? I mean, it's sort of what's the grand jury test in American law? The reason, no.
Reasonable person standard.
No, not that one. It's sort of, if all of this ends up adding up together, it makes a case.
You have to be able to provide relief somewhere.
Yeah, and that's the other one is, can the PJC do anything about this? Even if it all adds up, is there anything that we can do that's going to make anything different? Make it better. That's the relief that Duncan is mentioning. So the answer is, one, they can file a complaint anyway. And they can put lots of work on my shoulders, even if it's not worth much. And nobody at the presbytery level, including me, can ignore that, can say, this is worthless. Away it goes. No, I've got to go through all the steps then to make sure that response happens. The second thing is, do they have to do it? The thing is, if they want it sustained at the synod level, they're probably going to need to lay out a reasonable argument for why it fails to meet the relevancy test. Yeah. Which is back to what your question really was. Ed?
When it comes to the presbytery, I'm assuming that the JDT is going to have to explain how they got to their final determination, what the final determination was, so on and so forth. Is that accurate?
That is my encouragement.
Okay. If that is done and somebody doesn't like it, just because they don't like it, why would they not have to come back and say something at that time, before that remedial complaint could even be lodged?
It would strengthen their case if they had. There is not, to my knowledge, anything in the rules of discipline that requires a person to object to an action of presbytery during the debate in order for them to complain against that action later.
See, where it's a little confusing to me, for us, is that when we went through our training, and even before that, there was discussion about, wouldn't it be nice if on the front page of the Metro section, we could have a happy ending?
Yep.
And yet that's the very thing that would turn it upside down on the Metro page. Is that going to be explained at a Presbyterian meeting where these kinds of things are discussed?
That I can't answer because it would not be for me to explain that to the presbytery. I think we might have somebody in the room who could.
It's not a matter of should, is it? It's a matter of should. If indeed what you were saying is really the sense of the body.
Yeah.
It would be nice to walk out, shaking hands, pat on the back, and wow, this was great.
Yeah. I think it will belong to the JDT to show to the presbytery why not only should we begrudgingly accept this, but really why you're excited about it and you think we should be too. And I think that there is plenty of room for the JDT to use that bully pulpit that they'll have for a little while in presenting their matter to swing the presbytery's heart on it as much as its mind. Rather than ending that Q&A moment right there, there are two other hands in the room that I think are directly related to you, Ed. Yours is separate from Ed? Okay, Steve, were you going to speak to Ed's thing in particular?
I was. I was simply going to respond. I think Ed raises a very good question. It'd be a fair question to raise to anyone who came along later, complaining that I haven't said anything before. But the fact is, and this was my thought with your response to the earlier question, in the church, like in civil courts, anybody can sue anybody for anything, anytime they want to. Doesn't mean it's going to be a sustained case, but if they want to bring the charge, they can. We can't stop them. I think, though, that when we do, anyone who came along later complained that I haven't said anything before. But the fact is, and this was my thought with your response to the earlier question, in the church, like in civil courts, anybody can sue anybody for anything, anytime they want to. Doesn't mean it's going to be a sustained case, but if they want to bring the charge, they can. We can't stop them. I think, though, that when we do meet, when we do receive reports from the JDTs, we will frame it in a way that explains what is happening and what the meaning of it is, and we will seek to have as full and open a debate as we can, so that when we do leave, even if there may be some disagreement, even if there may not be unanimous vote, we can point to the fact that there was a very fair and open debate. This was not railroaded. There was nothing unseemly about how we arrived at our conclusion, and I think that's our best defense. We'll do everything we can to create that kind of a situation.
One of the things that I ought to add here probably is, remember, this talk today is just about the trust clause, right? This talk is not about all of the JDT process and dismissal and discernment. There are many other pieces that will go into that final report that the JDT brings to Presbytery. There may be somebody in the crowd whose mind is specifically on just the trust clause, and that's why this is sort of a day of be sure you know what you're doing here. But my hope as well would be that that the trust clause piece is kind of satisfactory, and then there is this preponderance of other things. I mean, I'm grateful you're quoting me back on the Metro. I really would love to see an article that people read in the outside world and their answer is, wow, the church is getting along. Go figure. Right. Okay, hand in the back.
They would never report on it. So is there a time frame that people can bring a complaint? Because I think the thing that happened in the Northwest is somebody should have brought a complaint, and they didn't. And so there's just this ongoing bad blood. But if there was a cutoff date, then people would have had to make a choice, and I'm not sure. But you know, at that Presbyterian meeting, people were just irate but then the people were told very strongly that they needed to rubber stamp because these Presbyterians had done hard work and they were screwing the people in the Presbytery who'd done hard work, and so people were between a rock and a hard place in the meeting. But I think is there a time frame? You know, you have 60 days, you have 30 days or whatever, so people know once it's past that date, they're done, but people have this amount of time to sort of go home, process, and do what needs to be done to make everybody feel like it was above board.
Yes. I'm going to give you two answers to that. One is the short answer and one is the practical answer. The short answer is anytime there's a complaint, it's a 90-day window from the point at which Presbytery takes action. Here's the practical answer, which is a little more complicated. Because a dismissal of a church is effective immediately upon the presbytery action, but the congregation has to have a chance to say whether they like it or not. The presbytery will not be able to vote to say, we're going to dismiss such and such a church according to these terms, period. Because then that church is gone and those terms are in effect, and that church, if they don't like it, it's too late, too bad. So what I'm going to encourage the motions that come to read will be, according to these terms, pending affirmative vote of session and congregation. Which means then that the action of presbytery will kick into gear on the date that those last votes in the church happen. And the session and the congregation have a 90-day window after the presbytery vote to decide what they think about the idea. So you could hypothetically have a presbytery vote in June, and in late November, it would still hypothetically be timely for somebody to complain about it. If June the presbytery votes, and then in August the congregation votes, because that's when it becomes effective, and then the person has 90 days after that congregation vote, because that's the presbytery date of action, to file a complaint. Now, I would expect that most sessions and congregations are going to be motivated to move a lot faster than that, that if they hear in June, say June 7th of the presbytery vote, by June 28th, they're going to have that done. Okay, right, June 7th and a half. But it is possible that what presbytery delivers to the congregation doesn't like the first time around. And what it does is it allows session and the congregation to work with each other to get to the point of acceptance. You know, if the first congregational vote is no way, but the session knows, folks, this is the best we've got, then it gives 90 days for the session to work on the congregation to say, look, take it, please take it, right? But I do expect that what Don's prediction is probably, you know, if you're in Las Vegas, go with Don's prediction. Don't go with the 90-day window. Anyway, somewhere then between 90 days and 180 days after that presbytery vote is what we'd be looking at for a window of complaint. Did I see a hand over here? Yeah.
Sorry for walking in late, but my feet brought me here. In the 7th and a half day, the congregation says this is just terrific.
Yep.
And they bring a check to Presbytery for the agreed-on amount. At what point in time will Presbytery hand the quitclaim deed to the congregation?
I actually need to check with the folks in Louisville on my obligations regarding judicial process that way. It may be that my obligation is to make it so right away, and it may be that my obligation is to leave the window open until it closes, for the very reason that this Danville event ended up being bad blood in San Francisco. But I don't know the answer to that yet. It was not an issue in the only one that I dealt with. And I do plan to find out where that sits, yeah. Fritz?
Just out of curiosity, other than Danville, how many of these have gone to the judicial proceedings?
To the GAPJC?
Yes.
I don't know for sure, but I'd say probably less than 5.
Do you have any idea what the outcome has been in this case?
No. No, Tom is by far the most interesting of them. It is valuable, though, if you are in the conversation on the ground with these churches, to keep in mind that the world of Presbytery settlements pre-Tom and the world of Presbytery settlements post-Tom really can't be compared to one another. Okay, let me pause a minute and give an opportunity to those of you who have not yet raised your hand. Jim?
Well, one obvious question is, what other considerations that go into relevancy
That is not defined.
at all?
Not by Tom, not by any of the interpretations of the trust clause in the Book of Order.
What about by the congregations that have been released already? In other words, what precedents have already been established as a function of?
It's an intriguing question, and I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. That would certainly be something that the discernment teams could
Use.
explore.
Yes,
Yeah.
it would be something beneficial to the presbytery to understand what they are and to share them with the JPCs.
Noted. I don't have a pen.
Here.
I need to have one on my pocket.
You may want to use it.
I may. All right, Karen, then Dawn.
I wondered if you or anybody else, because they may know more than you, just talk a little bit about this thing that happened in the California courts, because this wasn't an issue before where we were. California courts decided that the property belongs to the denomination. And so, that's kind of, has to be the starting point in California. But this could become a civil, I mean, we have our own court system, but in California, it can become someone in the Presbytery could go outside of the Presbyterian system and go to the secular court system, correct?
Correct.
Talk about that.
Okay, yeah, is there anybody here,
How that works.
who knows California law on that kind of matter? Is your hand contributing to that question, Kirk?
Contributing to that question, it deals with standing. You have to have standing in order to bring that kind of civil suit. In the case you're talking about, All Saints Church in Long Beach and the church down in Newport Beach, they sued the diocese to take their property with them. So because they had standing, they were able to sue. I don't believe that anyone could initiate a lawsuit along that line because they don't have standing. I think
So-
the question is-
But I have some.
So who would be the people who have standing then, Kirk? Can you clarify that?
Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've been living with that decision with friends as well, who were part of some friends that were involved in the law things. People that would have standing would be the Los Ranchos Presbytery. The Los
Okay.
Ranchos Presbytery would have standing, a member of the Presbytery would not.
So the church itself or the presbytery itself?
Because the Presbytery is acting in its fiduciary responsibility as a trustee, they would then have standing.
Okay, that's helpful. Anybody have anything else?
Has anybody tried that? Because that doesn't make sense.
I don't think it would ever get to court. They throw it out.
Okay, Duncan, is that related to Karen's question? Because Dawn's,
They're gonna defer to the denomination and let their court system figure it out. They're gonna say, you can't try to pull a church out. So I think they're gonna push it back to the denominational stuff. It's not based on any legal.
No, you can't do that legally. I mean, you really can't do that legally, so I'll ask a lawyer. I got a million lawyers in my family, I'll ask them, it's okay.
all right, Dawn.
Just a clarification on something previously, you said that when the session and the congregation approved the dismissal, after Presbytery had approved it, that the Presbytery action became final. But then you said the quitclaim might not be filed for potential time, if you were advised from Louisville accordingly. What's the meaning of that, the Presbytery action became final? Does that mean the property is then, at that point, with the congregation, or the trust clause is still in effect until a quitclaim is filed?
I'm not sure I can choose between those two. And that may be because I don't know my law well enough to speak to that. The way that I would put it is that if I can't, or if I'm obligated not to sign the quitclaim as corporate secretary immediately, it would be because I am obligated in my office to maintain the opportunity for judicial process according to the Book of Order, and that is a 90-day rule. So the very latest that I would sign off on that would be 90 days after that session congregation vote, when it is clear that the window is shut.
Does that mean then that the dismissal is not effective until that quitclaim?
No.
Until that window is closed?
The dismissal would be effective the date of the vote, because that's when the action occurred. The transfer of membership to whatever other denomination would be as of that date.
But the dismissal would be with property.
Right.
Sorry to ask interesting questions.
That is a very interesting question. Did I give you that pen back?
Along with that question, I don't believe we have to get congregation as well as session to vote after the Presbytery says yes. Dismissal is approved. I only believe the session has to then approve the deal, and then it's binding between the two parts, Presbyterians and that congregation. I don't think the session needs to have a vote by the congregation.
Given how I read Section 3J of the policy, it would appear that both session and the congregation have to take action. And in Presbyterian language, take action means vote. Yeah, I
I
would,
didn't visualize that, but that's there.
Yeah.
There's no problem because we have a vote going on.
yeah,
As a matter of fact.
I think that both of those gates have to be passed, so to speak, yeah. Okay, ladies first.
Wow, thank you. I have a two-part question, sort of cheating here. The first is all assets count. So we aren't just looking at land and buildings, we're supposed to look at bank accounts and stuff in the buildings and
Yep.
yada yada?
Yep,
Okay, and then it seems like what you're also saying is that, that the Tom case is saying you can't just talk about it and take it into consideration, that the final decision has to show a real relationship between the value of the all and what we're asking. Is that true? And what if you got a
Right.
decision that didn't reflect anything about the property? Because they said we talked about it.
then it would quite likely be subject to judicial review.
Or maybe they say we talked about it, but the property was worth so little because it was a poor church or something like that. I don't know. Could that,
Yeah, the second one would have more substance to it. Did everybody hear what Kathy proposed for the alternatives? Okay. Was that both parts?
yes, it was.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hugh?
hearing, once Presbytery approves, the congregation has the property. But we are dismissing the church to a different denomination. What are their trust law clauses?
Yeah.
Are we creating independent Presbyterian churches, in other words,
Okay.
as far as property is concerned?
Let's see. I think I have 3 answers in there for you. A couple of them you specifically asked, and one of them is a little beyond what you asked, but is important to know. Answer 1 is it depends on which denomination they're dismissed into. Their polity will affect that. There is nothing in the word Presbyterian per se among all of probably 18 or 20 Presbyterian denominations in the United States that standardizes who owns the property. So some of the denominations explicitly state that all the legal title and everything else is for the congregation and by the congregation. So when you say, is it congregational vis-a-vis property, the answer would be, well, I guess you could talk about it that way. That's probably accurate. The last part is something that you didn't ask, but I think given the way that some of these questions, including yours, Hugh, are being framed, is important to articulate, which is, in any of these scenarios, let me see if I can find, let's talk about this one. We are not talking about a release from the trust clause. We are not saying at any moment that this property ceases to be subject to the use and benefit rules of the PCUSA. What we're saying instead is that some action that occurs causes the property to transfer into a form that remains with the PCUSA. So let's do just the obvious one for the sake of the exercise. Church is sitting on a plot of land with a building on it. And you say, this has to be for the use and benefit of the PCUSA. One of the ways that the plot of land with the building on it can remain for the use and benefit of the PCUSA is that by some beautiful legal means, the land and the building get turned into cash. And that cash is for the use and benefit of the PCUSA. That's an important distinction to remain in mind, that the settlement fulfills the trust clause. It doesn't come up with a way to waive the trust clause. And the test before Presbytery will be, does it fulfill it? And the test before the fussy, litigious individual will be, does it fulfill it? And the test before the Synod PJC will be, does it fulfill it? That's kind of what we're working on here. Don.
Clarification, which was brought up by Kathy, reflecting on her comments. If we're talking about all assets and the settlement must be relevant, if, for example, like the Tom case, the settlement included consideration of per capita, consideration of mission giving, and consideration for the property. Now, does the property have to include bank accounts as well as, so the settlement being relevant needs to address not only the value of the physical property, but the value of the bank accounts as well?
Correct. Any kind of holdings that count as, what's the opposite of a liability? An asset. That count as an asset on the book. And yeah, you can subtract the liabilities from that, but we're talking about the whole value. Here's,
Even though in the Appendix B, attachment to the thing, it lists all the bank accounts, that doesn't necessarily say that the settlement is related to it in a relevant way, or does it?
I don't know the policy up and down well enough to be able to answer that question, whether it explicitly states it. But that is an explicit presumption of the Tom case.
If the person making a complaint against the decision, and it goes on to the judicial body, and the judicial body were to see in favor of the church seeking dismissal, is there still another step where a person could go back to the judicial body and start something up again? You may have answered that. I just,
Yeah. Let me correct a piece there.
Yeah.
The Synod PJC is not going to find in favor of the church. The Synod PJC would find in favor of the presbytery acting in an appropriate way. The Synod will sit in judgment, if they are called to, on the presbytery's choice. The Synod will not sit in judgment on the church versus the presbytery.
The second round could come from appeal.
There could be an appeal, but then that appeal would be against the Synod for not doing its job right. It would not be an appeal just saying, we don't like what you came up with.
But that could be done.
It could be. Welcome to America.
That's why Tom ended up at the GA.
Okay. Lori?
Lisa.
Lisa, sorry.
And I just want to make sure that I understand. I'm a little newer, I think, at this than the rest of you in this room. But when it comes to voting at the presbytery, with it you coming to all those, so many of churches leaving, do those voting rights end when the presbytery has voted them out and it's gone through the second reading and everyone's on board, or does it end when the congregation and the elders vote out, the session votes it out, or does it end at the very end of this 90-day period when the property and everything's finalized?
The middle answer.
The middle answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Especially if we're doing it the way that I'm proposing, which is that the presbytery action is pending congregation and session approval. That means that the presbytery action doesn't happen until the congregation and session vote. And then it happens immediately upon that vote. And so yes, at that point, the church would become a member of the new denomination. The members of the church would have a period of time during which they could choose whether to go with the membership of that new denomination or be transferred onto the rolls of the presbytery. The pastors would be in a similar place. There's a bunch of kind of execution and cleanup work, and I don't remember which of the three gentlemen in the front row it was who raised the question of kind of how does it all work out because of this window of 90 days. But that is something that I'm going to need to make sure I know the answer to. Yeah.
So I don't know about or care really about the situations of the churches in specific, but if a church has essentially used the trust clause to their benefit prior to asking to be, and so is in a fiduciary relationship with the presbytery such that the presbytery has signed off on whatever it is they wanted, their loan for their new building or whatever, do they have to buy themselves out of that responsibility as part of the presbytery before they leave, or are we on the hook for continuing in that fiduciary relationship? I mean, you know what I'm talking
Yep.
about?
Yep.
We sign off, and the trust clause is to their benefit until the day they want to take over the property. So we have signed off on their loan or their.
There are a couple answers. There are actually three answers there. And I think I'm going to have to call it then because I'm looking at the clock. Answer one is, it is my strong hope that the JDTs will know that and include it when it's relevant. And yes, the debts should transfer as well. The second answer is that if there were a case where a denominational loan agreement like the Presbyterian Investment and Loan program had a debt with or had a credit with a church, those become immediately due and payable when the church leaves the denomination. The third answer is we don't have any in that situation, so we don't have to cross that bridge. But the first bridge, yeah, that needs to be carefully followed by the JDTs. And it would be part of the responsibility of the presbytery to ask the question in the presentation, did all the loans get looked at, and is it clear in this arrangement that the loans are closed up? Or at least that they're carried into the new life and not left behind with the presbytery. I think we better wrap it. What I'm going to do is, if you do have more questions, you're certainly welcome to talk with me on the side about them. If you have questions and there's a small enough turnout of different people at the next one, we can continue the Q&A, because I'm going to do this one over again. If you think this has been valuable and important, my encouragement is go tell your friends, and if there's a strong enough response, sort of, well, I didn't know this was happening at Presbytery, but I sure want to be a part of something, and I can get 50 people together. If you can get 50 people together at your church or several churches together on a Saturday morning or something like that, I'll be glad to do this again there.
Are you going to review some of this on the 8th?
Yeah. Yeah. For those of you who are parts of the JDTs, we've got multiple subjects we have to cover a week from this coming Saturday. This is part of it. Well, now let me say it differently. The matter of the trust clause and the presbytery's relationship to the PCUSA as a fiduciary is going to be one of 5 or so important conversations that we have that morning.
Is that meeting open to only JDT or can other people?
No, that's a JDT day. Yeah. Yeah. Although you're a JDT, so.
PR on it says that JDTs will be given the priority.
Preference.
Is
Yeah.
there any chance you'll have an answer to the issue of considerations relative to relevant?
By then, probably not. I will.
The reason why I asked the question, Forrest.
I'm going to let you all be dismissed. We'll continue talking, but we do need the marketplace to do its thing.
In reviewing several of the churches that have been dismissed already, it's becoming clear, at least in their documentation, to ascertain that relevancy considerations have been things like all loans are paid, initial funding for the development of the church